Good afternoon. My name is Kunkayas from the Indigenous clan of the Haida Nation. My English name is Laara Mixon. Honored to be here today and want to start off as well to acknowledge traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. I wanted to start off by giving you a bit of an idea when I heard some of the other speakers talk this morning, and I walk. I don't stand still, I walk. So they've set me up so I can walk around, so I might be coming your way, so be prepared. So what I heard and what I think is really important to share with you today is that our worldviews, each of us on the EDST team and each of you doing your own work in your leadership role in your communities, have your own worldview and understandings how things work. For me, my worldview comes from a combination of experience and training that started when I was quite young. For some reason, when I was 16, I started getting pushed into management roles really quickly. When I was 14, I had to lie about my age to be able to support myself and work at McDonald's. I was 16 and they started pushing me into supervisory roles. By the time I was 16, I was working in retail and ended up working in 7 years in high-end retail businesses, including Whole Renfrew just down the street here. Then I went on to working for about 10 years in Five Diamond hotels. Now for me, the impression that was left working in Five Diamond hotels, particularly the Pan Pacific, which is an ISO certified organization. Now, if anyone hasn't heard about ISO certification, what it is an international standard by which they take a look at the organizational capacity to do the work it needs to do. Just like Brian was talking about earlier, there are layers, nested layers of organizational development capacity that are built over time. And what happens in an ISO certified community or organization or community is that those layers of understanding of competency and organizational efficiency translate to a level and a standard of care and operations that is world-class. Now, working in a Five Diamond hotel when I was in management at the age of, I can't even think back then, early 20s, and I was in management and responsible for 200 or 300 people at a time in the hotel. What I was told is that when you're working in the business, my competency in terms of management had no reflection on me. It had a reflection on the staff who I worked with. So if you had challenges as a staff member, that was my fault. Because as a leader in that organization, my job was to support you to do your best job. So my understanding of leadership got completely turned on its head, and yet it still resonated for me because when I was younger, I was raised with an understanding that we came from a hereditary chief family. Chief Joe from Masset, who one of the nicest, kindest gentlemen that I think I've ever run across in my life. And he had a very humble way of leading, consistent with a lot of our traditional hereditary leaders. And his understanding of leadership was that he was there to serve the members, which is diametrically opposed to what sometimes we hear in our communities with Chief and Council and other organizations where leaders have authority and power over people. So my understanding from a Haida perspective, from a First Nations worldview, was that leadership was about serving your members, about meeting the will and interests of the members collectively. So that resonate understanding of ISO certification and that level of discipline and training that was instilled in me on my work and my early experience helped me to understand how to help moving forward, not just my own work, but also serving my community. So I went on from there to shortly thereafter completing some work with the hotels to running across someone who recommended that I meet with Joe Gallagher. And I decided that I had skills and competencies because every single time I could take training in the hotels, I took it. Management training, supervisory training, discipline, conflict resolution, performance evaluation training, how to manage people effectively. I took every single one you could. And I thought those skills would help contribute to our communities in some way, shape, or form. And within a couple weeks of meeting Joe and starting to work really quickly, I was given the portfolio for supporting the business and economic development for the 55 Coast Salish nations, which meant that I went out and helped entrepreneurs individually to support their businesses to be realized and nations to help support their band-owned businesses to be realized. What I was given was probably about 3 pieces of paper and was told, here, go do a workshop on small business development. I went, are you kidding? Teach them with this? So I did all the research I could. And every single time I went out to go do a workshop, which was about once every 2 weeks for the 55 Coast Salish Nations, so I was traveling all over this area. I said, what do you need to learn? What do you need to hear about? What are the challenges you realize, and what are your dreams? How can I help to provide the support of information, tools, anything you need to help you realize your dream of entrepreneurship or small business or business development? And I kept getting feedback, and I kept updating this workbook and updating it and updating it. Year after year, we got national awards from the NACA organization in terms of our success with those workshops. Those workshops were then shared across the province when I went into becoming the manager of the Aboriginal Business Service Network for BC, where I helped establish small business centres across BC, Aboriginal small business centres. Those tools went on to be accredited through NVIT to help support community economic development or any other range of education and training people wanted to proceed on to. So that gave me an understanding of, when I did that, to the importance of small business and economic development, but also at the same time when people started asking me about how do I start a gas station, I didn't have those skills then. So I called up a bunch of mentors, people who've been doing this for 30, 50 years. And I talked to Mike Lewis and Frank Brown, who did business and community economic development across North America for a combined 60 years of skills and talent and experience with First Nations. And they had a very grassroots approach as well to everything they did. If you want to do community planning, if you want to do a business, if you want to do a development corporation, start talking to the people to say, what are your goals and dreams and interests for yourself and your children? Now let's put all of that data together to see what the community wants. Basically a comprehensive community plan, long before a comprehensive community plan came into place. This was community economic development best practices. And I took that on, I soaked it up. And that's how I started doing community economic development strategies, not just economic development strategies based on industry trends or external data or demographic trends or industry trends, internal or external to the community. I started asking the people. And that ended up with us being able to do things like share a whole buffet of opportunities to community members and then say, what do you want for your children? How does this opportunity look? Does this make sense to you? And then you tell us, as leaders who are here to serve you, what you want to see in your community. We ended up with very, very effective community economic development strategies where members not only identified those economic development priorities that they wanted to see realized, but they also owned them. So we had this popcorn effect of small business ideas being generated all over the place where someone would say, well, that's a great gas station, but you know what, I could do a tire business. Great, how can we support that? So those kinds of things happen, and what it does when you involve members, not only is that good governance, it also helps to be able to support understanding and approval of your plans when they're the ones who own and created that plan. So the resistance, the entropy, the inefficiencies are almost reduced. And that's, again, what I learned from working at hotels. So my experience and my worldview comes from that service leadership. Now, on top of that, that interest really came to me in a need to be able to explore leadership further. What does it mean? So you're going to hear a lot of information about how I understand leadership from having a master's degree in leadership and 2 levels of value certification training from London in the UK. So I wanted to get my teeth into this to understand it completely, and I'll share with you some very high-level insights to what is seen and how it affects us as First Nations. So what I'm hoping that you'll be able to understand through the end of this workshop is to understand how governance and operations work effectively to support economic development opportunities to be realized. To understand how the Indian Act and traditional shared leadership systems and values affect good governance. To understand nested levels of policies that support effective governance and administrations, like Brian was talking about, those levels of competency that can be developed within an organization. To understand key components of culturally relevant governance policy model. So it's a model that over many, many communities I've served has become a model that I like to use, and it has remained pretty static for at least 7 years now, because I keep asking if they need to see anything else, and I always get, no, this is perfect. So I think it's coming to gel together to the point where it's been tested. Understand how good governance supports assertion of rights and economic development, and consider future policy development needs and the universality of good governance, like Brian was talking about. So what we're going to talk about, just quickly again, my understanding of how we approach this work, and if you've ever had a chance to read Sean Atleo's book called Research is Ceremony, he describes as an Indigenous person how undertaking any work like a comprehensive community plan, a skills inventory, a community economic development strategy is sacred work. Because we're affecting the lives of future generations. We're affecting the lives of children and women who don't have a voice. We're affecting people who we need to represent and stand to be able to do that well. So my philosophy when I took a look at this, when I was doing my research for my master's degree, for some reason it was one of the biggest areas I struggled with because of all the Western values and views that come from academia that are predominantly Western. And I had to figure out for a long time, what am I going to rest my worldview on? And I finally read Dr. Atleo's book, Tsawak. And the Tsawak, Natsamat from this area, all have the same message and universality within BC and probably within most First Nations in Canada. A deep appreciation and traditional value of the understanding of our interconnectedness and our interdependency. And what I do will affect you. What I do will affect future generations. What I do will have effects in other areas we cannot see yet. So we have to act with integrity and be responsible in everything we do. So the work that I did when I was looking at this, I really wanted to be able to outline some key criteria that hopefully can plant some seeds for you that will keep that information relevant for you. When I took a look at it, I decided to use some approaches and understandings that include and incorporate best practices from nation rebuilding research. And you've heard nation building and nation rebuilding. So I had the good fortune of working with Dr. Stephen Cornell from the nation building in the University of Arizona, the Harvard Institute. And he said that after a few years of saying nation building, he was corrected by so many elders that they're calling it nation rebuilding because the elders asserted that we have always been nations. We are not new. We are the first peoples. We're the Indigenous peoples of this land. We are rebuilding our nations, but we are not new nations. So I call it nation rebuilding. I'm also going to impress upon you some of the ideas around total quality management that I talked about already quickly. And again, some of the understandings that I've been able to have the good fortune of drawing on from having worked with a committee of Indigenous leaders from around the world for the NVIT Aboriginal Governance and Leadership Training Program, which is a certificate, diploma, and advanced diploma program. And to also some of the new leadership training that I've been doing with Natsamat Tribal Council. And most importantly, the 6 steps of assertion of First Nations right for economic development, which the NRT's research did. And that included, just so you know, the depth of that research was quite significant. 226 research papers were looked at. Primary research with 10 First Nations communities and individuals. A needs assessment survey with 78 participants, mostly in remote communities across BC. So this is the voice of BC, who gave us the understandings of these steps. What I generally recommend when we talk about leadership training, and I'm just going to say this broadly because this is not what we're doing today, but I would say broadly, if you have leadership training being brought into your community, I would recommend that it does so with an understanding that it should meet the needs and interests of those leaders who exist in your community today, who have a deep understanding and knowledge of what those challenges are that they face, and the skills and competencies that are required to lead effectively. It should also take a look at that validated secondary research, whether it's in the organization or external to it. And I say validated because there's a lot of First Nations communities who have knowledge or traditional knowledge that's been researched by people who haven't done well by that nation, whether it's intellectual property, whether it is misrepresentation of information, whatever the issue is, ask the community to make sure that your research is validated. It's also, like Brian was saying, looking at best practices, internal and external to the community. Even if they have had challenges in some of the work that they've done in prior projects, look at what was learned, lessons learned, what worked well in that project, what didn't. The other ones are looking at the findings of an analysis with a committee or a group of representatives who represent the community, whether it's a leadership or family heads or hereditary chiefs or a youth and elder, or however it comes together that the community would like to see their members involved in the research because it is their information. To have them participate in understanding and support it so that they can understand what they're looking at, to say, you know what, that research says this, but I think it's because of this history, which means that we need to tweak that little piece a bit. Good. And they can tell you what's important for them, not for you as a researcher. The other piece is to make sure that the review of the final report is undertaken with the community and, at the very least, that committee to say this is valid. Yes, we agree what you found. And the reason those things are so important are because, I'll just finish this piece here, and we talked about it already, so I'm just going to quickly jump over this. These are the steps that are in the research that NRT did that Brian so well laid out. It's preparing, planning, engaging, negotiating, implementing, and evaluating. And my job today is to share with you some of that preparatory work required to set the stage or to lay the foundation. Now, in the research, what was interesting to find in that comprehensive piece of work, that comprehensive body of work, is that a key finding from that work was that the majority of those interviewed were struggling with internal governance and how to effectively implement. So governance is a key challenge. That planning stage is a key challenge, and it's complex. And I hopefully will share with you a lot of information and tools that will give you some insight into that. So what does it mean to operate effectively as a First Nations government and as a First Nations administration? I think there's a couple things that need to be understood when we say that. First and foremost, the chief and council system that most First Nations, or other than the self-governing ones who have their own self-governing agreements, that they work within in Canada are not our systems. Our systems of leadership were traditionally shared horizontal systems of leadership where many people stepped up to the plate to engage members, to make collaborative decisions. And we are sitting now with a very narrow hierarchical system that is inconsistent with our traditional governing systems. In fact, that was only given up after 18 months of fighting and threats of imprisonment, that it was finally put into place, the chief and council system. So it is not our system. It has its limitations, most importantly of which is the effective assembly of citizens and participation, where we see family heads, hereditary leaders, family representatives, whatever is pertinent in terms of terminology to refer to those people in your community who represent the voice of your families or extended families in decision-making within the community. Those ones are used more effectively, and many First Nations are using that type of system and revitalizing that type of system to be able to engage members more effectively through comprehensive community plans, through community economic development plans, and even one community I have the honor of working with today, Lac-Mel, pay them as much as they do almost their councils to sit as family heads alongside their chief and councils to make decisions and understand the current situation and issues facing leadership. So they work collaboratively with their traditional and contemporary systems. The other one is that we, as First Nations, have collectivist values. Western values, when we talk about business, joint ventures, partnerships, those come from a perspective of individualistic values, meaning that the Western worldview, when you're talking about a partnership agreement, Dennis, you probably get this all the time, when they're talking about something, someone sitting across from the table, not having an understanding of First Nations, will be saying almost a different language. And they'll be saying, I want this, and that's individualistic. In the meantime, Dennis's view, along with all of ours, is what's best for our community, not what's best for me. What's best for our community? And that's collectivist values. When people hold collectivist values, they're speaking a different language than most Canadians. That's something that has yet to be understood, and it's not something that just has very little research to support it. Gert Holstead spent 50 years, now 52, taking a look at different nations around the world to identify and understand how people view the world. So collectivist nations like Japan, China, others have the same view. What's in it for us, not what's in it for me. What happens is that those impacts to partnerships and joint ventures or working in an organization that has those collectivist values, there's usually a key few areas that are challenges, and you'll probably hear these a lot. Issue resolution. So when you're looking at developing a development corporation, working within your own organization to build capacity, or working in a joint venture, addressing those key issues with an understanding of everyone having to collaborate to work towards understanding predefined agreements helps to mitigate risk and mitigate conflict. Similarly with collaborative decision making, our people are used to working more collaboratively to arrive at a decision, where hierarchical systems have a chain of command, and they relinquish that authority to one little person at the top. Other one is communication and employee engagement. And we hear communication all the time, and that's because of as collectivist peoples and the hierarchical system that we are stuck with for now, that we have a more difficult time trying to communicate in the way we used to with everybody on a more frequent basis through traditional shared leadership systems. Now, traditional leadership systems aren't something that just in communities work well. The Western corporate world is realizing this. IBM, Google, all of the large organizations are creating more horizontal shared leadership systems because they operate more effectively. Other than in times of war, you revert to hierarchical. Otherwise, it's shared leadership systems that work more effectively than any other system. So, having understood some of those preliminary or preamble pieces and understandings to how to operate an organization effectively or govern an organization effectively, the first most important piece, as I've said earlier, is that servant leadership works really well with First Nations because traditional systems of leadership, traditional perspectives of leadership, our collectivist values as Aboriginal people allow and support that to happen more meaningfully. Having said that, good governance is the act of collaboratively establishing and adhering to the rules that coordinate a community's actions and development to achieve their goals. Not yours, or not that of 2 or 3 people, or, as we heard about earlier today, a new chief in council that hasn't talked to anyone, has a couple of research papers, and hasn't done any due diligence or research and goes, this is a good idea. I've worked with so many communities who go, well, I've got this great idea, or here's this opportunity. Well, what's the research? The business plan that usually requires that kind of research. And often it goes without even having that research. Might be a good idea, but when the rubber hits the road, it's not going to work as well because those people who either should be expressing an interest to work in that organization or have their skills transferred or be a part of the organization or support its development have not been included. So it's really important to understand that not just in governance for the sake of good governance does a government operate with the intention of serving the will, understanding and serving the will of members. Development corporations that are owned by the community should also. So when we take a look at effective First Nations governments, the nesting of some of the policies and decisions that Brian talked about when you saw that great stack block of things that have to happen, this is just an example of some of them. Culturally relevant, comprehensive governance policies that are built upon your traditional systems and knowledge of how things work well in your community, that are effective, that people can understand and work with in terms of rules. Defined by your community, not by anyone else. The other one is comprehensive operations policies, finance policies, HR policies, basically anything that needs and requires and sees an activity happening more than once, there should be a rule set down for. And those rules, again, should be defined by the organization based on best practices, not only from within the organization, but externally to the organization as well. Other ones like Brian was talking about for community economic development, whether it's a community economic development strategy, again, putting the term community in there is purposeful, or a comprehensive community plan that's updated every 3 to 5 years. It's seeking the interests and will of your constituents to say, what can I do to help you achieve your interests and goals, and how can we work together to build a better future together, collectively, not so much. Working together as one. Then there are the other legal agreements that help support that as well, and Brian and others will do a great job to be able to describe some of those. But when we take a look at those, there are other ones that I just wanted to quickly mention because I did hear some of those questions, that when we take a look at those, there are also things like, again, looking at the interests of others, the members who are involved in the community. I had the honor of working with Chiacton, and they had surplus cash. And they said, well, how do we do this? And we went through with a planning committee and some really good leaders to sit down and draft a program where the community identified every single year they voted on priorities. And those funds went in those program areas to be able to support individuals or groups to undertake elder care activity in sports, small business development, areas where there were gaps. And then we established a handbook and guidelines on how that would be accessed and application forms. It's still working really well today. So whether it's a predetermined, again, well in advance of having those surplus cash, coming to an agreement like an issue resolution agreement, coming to an agreement when you do end up having enough funds coming through that you have profits that you can somehow benefit from, what should that do? Now again, going back to working with the Tsilhqot'in Nation, as they started to lead up to in the early years when I first started working with them, to looking at this agreement and the decision and working towards that kind of community consensus and understanding of what they could possibly do, we had that difficult conversation amidst great uncertainty and divisiveness within the nation itself. You will realize funds soon. How should those monies be spent? And now we look at best practices, and we shared that when we facilitated. Distributions generally don't work. Members always want them. But what happens, all you have to do is look at the oil sands. People with addictions, challenges of any kind, throwing money at them directly does not help. But if reinvesting those funds into programs like the Chiacton one allows for daycares, rec centers, libraries, tutoring, more children's programs, culture and language programs, language and culture camps that couldn't happen otherwise. And the community can define what those things are. But planning to be able to determine if we and when we do come into funds, what should we do with them, works much better than a reactive approach. So those are some of the layers of things that Brian also laid out, so I don't want to go into too much. But this, just to give you a quick example, is what people see and generally is understood in organizational development as building organizational capacity. So when we take a look at an individual instance, so I go to complain Miles about something in Haida Gwaii, one individual instance. 3 people come to him. Now there's a repetitive pattern, maybe we should do something about it. What should we do about it? 10 people come to him. We have to do something. We have to outline some kind of principle or rule or law, or how are we going to address the situation? As we start to develop those policies and rules of how things should operate, not just based on what we're seeing and experiencing, but also best practices, we start to create a scope and field of policies that, in terms of total quality management, addresses every single potential issue you may run into or you may affect. When we do that and we start to have that understood, and they're reviewed annually, all staff are incorporated into training sessions or review sessions or update sessions. And to your answer, I was thinking about when you said, how do we get people to understand their roles and responsibilities when they go out of scope? Review their roles and responsibilities. Do they have a valid reason for doing it? Is it pointing to a deeper root issue? If we do, let's work at the root issue, not what we see on the surface. And that's how we look at policy development when we do it. What are the root issues? What are the key decisions that have to be made to ensure that the organization operates effectively? When we get to that point and we're starting to all understand the rules and we all adhere to them, then we're at the point where those organizations, they call them institutionalized policies, institutionalized visions, institutionalized strategic plans. We all get it. We're all not smart. We're all working as one together. When we get to that point, The job of leadership then is to monitor and push towards continuous improvement. If we're making improvements of 5 to 10% increase in business development or return on investment per year, can we reasonably push that to 15? Can we reasonably push that to 20? That's continuous improvement. So that is an understanding of how organizational development, looking at Brian's demonstration, as well as the progressive steps or growth of an organization works. This is the model that I've developed over years using a modified governance policy model, similar to the total quality management that I already talked about. So if we were to take a look at a visual representation as a holistic plan for leadership to say, this is the scope within which a leader operates. This is what we're painting out there. What could that leader potentially impact or directly or indirectly affect? If any of those areas do not have written rules and policies or procedures to support how that work is done, we need to lay that out. And that's exactly what an ISO assessment is. So when Soyuz did this work for their hotel, this is exactly what happened. They went into the hotel and said, what happens if a guest comes up and this happens? I don't know. There should be a policy for it. Well, what if this happens? Well, this is what we do. Where's the policy for it? We haven't written it down. Write it down. And what I always think about is a lot of people say when I do this work, that we don't write everything down. We didn't write everything down. We didn't have to. We live in a different environment today. But we did have rules. We did have procedures. We did have protocol for everything, especially for leaders to do their job effectively. When we take a look at the role of chief and council today, generally what I write policies for in the scope of that responsibility area is how council does its work, as well as how council relates with the senior manager, which is their only link to guiding effective operations and accountability. And also, how do they remain strategic and accountable in terms of their reporting? And you don't see that. I've yet to see another consultant write those policies, but that's what our communities have asked for, and that's what I do, and that's what I've done based on best practices and making sure it's culturally relevant. Similarly, how does council relate with members? What kind of relationship should they have, and what are the rules and procedures for them to come together? How are community meetings conducted? Who chairs? What are the rules of chairing? What are the rights and responsibilities of members? All of those things are things that should be written down to be able to understand who does what in a community. And when someone says, well, actually, no, I do this, but I really want to do economic development and over here because it's really exciting. Review the policies. Again, are they doing it for their own purposes, which is conflict of interest? This doesn't have to be confrontational. It really should always be looked at in a proactive way, in a way to be able to look for genuine inquiry, where you can say, what was the purpose or what was the intent of that? If it points to a root cause of something, unearth that root cause and try and work on the root cause. So here's an example of some of the ones that are generally in that. Roles and responsibilities, code of conduct, conflict of interest, how meetings are, meeting and agenda setting. Issue resolution, again, a really big one. And the one that I use, it's an alternative dispute resolution process with a restorative justice model built into it. Thank you to the Statlium for making sure that was clear. Establishing committees and working groups that usually go rogue. If they go rogue, if we know the conditions by which they are ineffective but should be effective, let's create some rules and procedures around how they can be effective and mitigate that risk and mitigate that entropy or that inefficiency. Monitoring council performance for enumeration, how they review policies, how often, and how they're amended. Again, the relationship to the senior manager, which is their only point of contact for operations to make sure that they're effective and accountable. The next one is relationship with members that we spoke about, and I already went over some of those key pieces. Now, when I do this kind of work with communities, it's usually as much, and like I was saying in terms of some of this role of leadership development, it's as much about building capacity as it is to be able to agree upon and come to decisions around what some of those key things that should be in policies and the rules by which an organization operates. So it'll usually involve, may I use Stadtlium's example for the SGS? So when we did that, it was over 9 months, a year, it was a long time. We came together with the Stadtlium, the SGS board, and we went through the planning and allowed for members from all the Stadtlium communities to come sit in and give their input on things that they wanted to see in the policies as well as to be able to use those policies as templates because they contain Stadtlium language, concepts, and ideas from their traditional knowledge. And they were able to say, here are the things that we want to see in the policies that ensure that it's culturally relevant, and here's an area of impact that we hadn't thought about as a mother of 2 living in this remote community that I'd like to see from this organization. Fantastic. Good. Yes, it's relevant for them to be doing that. So yes, let's put it in the rules. This is the last piece, and again, it's something that we don't see very often. And it's really sad to see, and I'm sure a lot of people have been affected by this, hopefully less and less. I do see it less and less, where consultants will go out and they do a strategic plan that's a SWOT or not based on best practices. This is based on best practices and takes a look at either a comprehensive community planning model for something larger like that, or it takes a look at the operational functionality of an organization depending on the needs of the client, or it takes a look at a very, very high level, depending on the capacity of the organization as well, to be able to look at specific areas of impact that that organization has in the community as well. The process, again, always we try and look for elders or traditional knowledge keepers to imbue ideas. So for example, Stadtlium's conflict resolution or issue resolution policy was to teach the right way. That's how their leaders brought their leaders on board to understand if there's been a conflict or a challenge or they haven't adhered to the rules. Their job was collectively to come together to support that individual to say, we're going to now teach you the right way to do this. What a great way to take a look at issue resolution. We also take a look at what practices are in place, what experience and knowledge that collective group has that can contribute to that organization's efficiency, and what are those best practices that we can bring in that would make sense for them. Facilitating shared agreements. So we do take a look at making sure that those agreements are understood by everyone, that there's a consensus agreement. And that's generally what most First Nations want to see as opposed to a voting, which is, again, reflects the collectivist versus the individualistic way of doing things. Now you can also see that, again, this is not indicative of one model of good governance. As Brian said, good governance is good governance is good governance. It means and has interpretations and nuances depending on the community it serves and the needs and interests of the community it serves. But generally, and this model that we're looking at today is from the World Bank, that takes a look at some of the component parts that support good governance. First and foremost, the most important thing an effective good government has is that they are accountable. The next one is that they're transparent. Again, those policies and procedures being brought to every single meeting, the quarterly and annual reporting, to be able to say, look at these, look at our approved meeting minutes. This is all out in the open. We're not hiding anything. That builds trust and goodwill. Efficient and effective, and as per the nation rebuilding, that means it's culturally relevant. It means it has some of those considerations also for supporting the organization's development as well as individual organizational development capacity for those leaders who need to understand their role is not to be punitive in how they manage, but how to coach and support people to build their capacity. And to also make sure there's a strategic orientation in that work so that the strategic plan is reflected in the governance policies, is reflected in the operations policies, to all coalesce around the idea that every single person has a role and responsibility to contribute to realizing that vision of the entire community. It also means when good governments operate that they're responsive to the needs of community members. They're equitable and inclusive. Everyone's allowed to come in and participate, and they actually have a responsibility to do so. Consensus orientation, that the government is participatory in nature, that those substantive decisions that are made by a community that affect rights and title, or that affect any specific area the community wants to define as substantive is one that's a conversation held with the community. It also includes following the rule of law. And I don't mean just Western law. First and foremost, I mean your customary law, your own traditional laws. Other areas that are the cornerstones of capacity development include supporting institutional or organizational development, policy making that help to lay the foundation for that, supporting human resource and technological development, and strengthening administration and managerial capacities. Once these policies are developed and you have that framework, like Brian was saying, the natural tendency is to revert back to what we know. It's human nature. It's how our brains are wired. We want to go to something comfortable. For us to remain in a new, more effective method or way of doing it, we need those reminders to be able to say, let's stay the course, which means that annual reviews of policies, annual reviews and updates of the strategic plan from the CCP are necessary to make sure that we all are still rowing that canoe in the same direction. Once those operations policies are aligned, leaders, and I use the term very, very broadly because leaders exist at all levels in our communities. There's chief and council, there are community and youth leaders, there are hereditary leaders, there are elder leaders, there are people that come in and support our community, that are leaders that contribute to our community. So I mean leaders at all levels. Need to be able to make sure that those policies are understood and adhered to. Again, borrowing from Statliam, to teach them the right way. Adherence to these policies start with council though, and as Brian said earlier, we see that reversion, particularly in times of transition from one chief and council to another. And the inclination for a new chief and councils to say, like Brian said, we're going to do something new and better, and they throw everything out. And that's the problem. And that's exactly what shouldn't happen. Even if there are problems within an organization, it's important to take a look at it and analyze to say, what did we learn here from this then? What can we carry forward to be able to inform better practices in the future? So making sure that there's always that purposeful look, strength-based look at how you can move forward. And also to make sure that those are done through the lens of leadership by looking at bylaws, policies, procedures, those things that set the boundaries for the environment or establish the rules for the environment for the organization or the community to work effectively. The other thing is to make sure that if there is any kind of challenge, the question of leadership then is how do we look at this rule? How do we look at this policy? How do we look at this bylaw to say, what should it be doing then? And then again, do a little bit of proactive work to say, we're going to revise and amend this through a regular review process. And I always state that because if you don't, sometimes operations policies are updated in an ad hoc way. The ideas become disjointed, not everyone's included, and you end up with inefficiencies. It also opens the door for constructive dismissal class suits. So you want to go through a regular process, quarterly, semi-annually, annually to go through this review process. Now this is a really interesting one that Brian was talking about as well. When you have good governance, when you have that discipline of leadership to sit down and do that really difficult work of building consensus around what kind of society are we trying to build? What are the rules and responsibilities for us as leaders? What are the rules and responsibilities for you as members? What are the rules and responsibilities for you as administration? And everyone agrees to adhere to those things. Increasingly, that discipline is built and internalized within the organization and the people who are a part of it. We end up contributing to a good business environment that supports business and economic development. And as Brian was saying, what happens is people look from the outside or from the inside and go, wow, really disciplined. These guys are going places. And I see it in the communities I've worked with too. Over time, it's amazing to see how they're able to leverage opportunities and economies of scale and new business ventures when they're able to pull forward all this information and demonstrate through valid policies, procedures, supporting information that says, we have a set of rules and policies that we adhere to here. And what happens is when organizations do this, if you all remember Member2 doing this through their ISO certification about 15 years ago, they went through the difficult process of creating rules and policies for everything. And what happened? The world beat a path to their door. A small community of 200 or 300 people had the world knocking at their door to say, how can we do business with you? You operate at a world-class standard. You have rules for everything that you do, and we have faith and trust that that system's going to work for us too. Because we've read your rules and laws, and they make sense. And you adhere to them because we see it in your reporting. How can we work with you? And they still have people coming to their door. And Burnt Christmas, I don't know how many awards he's received as a part of that. So it's very, very important that this type of organizational development, as Brian said earlier, too, builds that foundation, that pre-planning to get your house in order, to set the foundation for business and economic development to thrive. Now, one important thing is that that conveys across, again, not just governments. Development corporations around the world have examples of good leadership as well and good governance that adhere to the same principles. Now, we'll go in through a few limitations in a minute, but I wanted to read this because I like some of these quotes here that really, really hit home some of the ideas that we're talking about today. Without dramatic improvement in Aboriginal governance and institutional capacity, or organizational development, progress on long-standing issues such as socioeconomic divide, unemployment rates, and education levels between Canada's Aboriginal population and non-Aboriginal population will remain elusive. That's from the Chamber of Commerce. They didn't cite exactly who the author was, but that's from the Chamber of Commerce. That's a huge statement. So when we take a look at that kind of organizational development capacity and building that depth of practice and knowledge and habits around how we manage and lead organizations, again, I'm using the term lead in a broadest category, we're able to support our communities to be able to do business economic development effectively. We're able to establish rules and practices that, just talking to some leaders in the room today, if you do those things, you leave a legacy for your next generation to step a little bit higher as well. When we take a look at these, again, one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that they go across boundaries. Good leadership, good governance, it doesn't matter if you're working in business or economic development or public service or NGOs or societies. Good leadership equals good governance. And that means to make sure that First Nations who can demonstrate these kinds of things are supported not only in some of the examples I shared with you today, but in some of the things that we know are on the horizon. Which means that as we see and assert greater sovereignty and rights with the federal and provincial governments, that they relinquish some of those responsibilities. Which means we need to step up and establish those rules and policies and procedures and agreements and proactive agreements and revenue sharing agreements and reinvestment agreements. It also means that we're going to be looking at things and defining for ourselves what that return on investment is, not just dollars. Member 2 and others take a look at a wealth creation model. That's supported in the United States by their accounting association and others in Canada, where we take a look at 4th, 5th, and 6th bottom lines that for us make sense, that for leading organizations in the private sector do as well, so that we support employment, sustainable environmental development, all different areas that we want to define for ourselves. It also means that we want to make sure in the assertion of those things in the future that we create and establish rules for taxation, which support most governments. Those taxation revenues and our own source revenues, we have to establish those similar types of disciplines for how are we going to do this? What should be happening? What is our purpose and function, and what should we be doing to make sure that we create a legacy that will sustain future generations, that 7th generation perspective. Also making sure that when we take a look at some of those other areas like infrastructure, like social development, when we take a look at things like peacekeeping. So for example, every single government around the world has some core competencies of things that they provide, including social development. One of the keys is the protection of citizens. First Nations in Canada don't have that support through INAC. And yet we have murdered and missing women in droves. We have high crime rates. And yet when we see those neighbors to the south who have jurisdictional authority and do those types of things and establish those rules of law for themselves in their own courts and their own prisons, they have a lower incidence of crime. So that's one reinvestment area potentially. Or when you get to the point of that kind of transfer or devolution of authority, We also see a lot of BC best practices that we're going to start having to create more and more for. So, and I'm just thinking about St'át'imc again, because it was really neat to work with their Northern St'át'imc Health Outreach Services. And they're a First Nations health hub, working towards increasing their capacity to work with health, similar to what we were talking about, I was going about to speak here. And the relationship was ahead of what the First Nations Health Authority can support in terms of those kinds of partnership agreements that allow those organizations to work collaboratively together. So that's the kind of thinking and proactive thinking we want to see happening more for employment and training, for our courts, for our legal systems, for those things we see on the horizon. For the development corporations, it's a bit unique, however. So some of the limitations that need to be recognized, as much as some of the others that I've pointed out in the past, are that when you hire a lawyer, like was spoken about earlier, look for people who have those expertise in those areas. There's been so many times I've seen lawyers and accounting firms develop Cadillac models for their development corporations that take tons of money and time and investment to deconstruct because they can't even maintain it. They're barely breaking even, setting up their development corporation with a few new ventures, and they get sold this Cadillac that they can't even afford to maintain. So having to devolve that and find a structure that works for them. Making sure that when we take a look at, when we establish our development corporations, a lot of lawyers who haven't had the history, and the majority do have this challenge, where they set up a development corporation. This is a fault in business law around the world. The default is that our accountabilities as development corporations is only to our shareholders. But community economic development corporations are held by constituents. Those assets held are the assets of the community held in trust by a development corporation, and yet the legal agreements, the legal structures do not account for that. And then hence the governance policies that direct our board of directors for development corporations to operate effectively, to be effective governing institutions for a development corporation, are inconsistent with the interests of the community. Right away, the pen's not even dry, and your legal agreement says that the only people they have to report to is the board. And quite often I go into communities and that's all that happens. And then the members are going, what happened? There was this whole big hullabaloo about establishing a development corporation. We never hear from them. Because the accountability should immediately include the constituents. So again, thinking about what should happen and what the purpose and function are to establish those rules that lay the groundwork for effectively working. When we take a look at a development corporation, Brian painted out, so I won't go into it too much, but leadership's role is that super high level to be able to say, here's your purpose and function, here's what you're supposed to be doing and the limits of what you're supposed to be doing, so your scope and things you can't do, and here's what we expect in terms of reporting and accountabilities. And then holding them accountable, monitoring them, saying, how come you don't have a quarterly report? You're supposed to, according to your governance policies that we were a part of looking at through a collaborative process, approving, that align and complement our processes. If you haven't got that quarterly report, how come? So those types of discipline are really, really important. And again, Brian spoke to this already, but the idea of separating business from politics was early in the nation rebuilding process to understand that chief and council members who are politicians should not be driving development corporations. That's a bit of a misnomer in the nation rebuilding research. And talking with Dr. Cornell, that is not the intent. The intent is that those same people should not be guiding both organizations because it creates risk. But what happens is if we can establish collaborative relationships and aligned working partnerships between a development corporation and a government that can support the assertion of title, that can support the assertion of economic benefits that arise from that type of alignment of work and effort, you'll see greater outcomes. So generally economists, and not even generally, across the board, economists agree that good governance equates to creating a positive business environment. So again, my job was to talk about how those structures and systems and discipline and laying that work out allows business to thrive. Again, some interesting quotes, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. So the Raybould, who did some First Nations work with the National Centre for Governance, said good governance is one of the keys to market confidence and investor satisfaction. From INAC, fostering good governance and strong accountability in Aboriginal communities help to increase investor confidence, supporting economic partnership and improving living conditions. So it's not just economic, it's also social conditions that improve with that type of discipline. This one I like as well because it explains it in a bit more detail. There are several areas where strong governance has a profound effect on growth, but most important is offering clarity. Governance provides a united goal, giving everyone a clear sense of what they're collectively trying to achieve. Without clarity of direction and funding, businesses are less likely to invest and make a long-term commitment to local areas. Our research has demonstrated that with those areas with strong governance, which we're attracting business and maintaining a healthy relationship with them. So the case for why good governance helps support and lay the framework for business and economic development to thrive is critical. It is the first step because it is one of the most important ones. And that habitual demonstration of leadership and discipline allows you to build organizations and agreements in a proactive, purposeful way that meets the needs of everyone, that creates wealth and benefit for the long term and future generations. So thank you so much for listening to me. I was watching this and lost a little track of time, so how are we doing for time? So questions?
Hi, Laara. One question here. Overlapping business and politics with same people, is that what you're advising not to do?
So a lot of communities will sometimes put the same people who are in chief and council in leading development corporations. Generally what I recommend, and I recommend it for both, but with the chief and council system we have, it's much harder to sell the idea, that leaders should be operating when they have the skills and competencies to be able to do so. So competency-based matrix for development corporations is really important to put out and make sure that you have those skilled people for your development corporation that have legal, accounting, and governance expertise to be able to contribute to that organization working effectively. And as well, those kinds of priorities the community identifies, forestry, fishing, whatever those are, that are the key opportunities that development corporation will be pursuing. Having said that, because our communities are so small, sometimes you'll have a chief and council member who has great expertise and knowledge and history in an area that makes sense for them to be on. I think that makes sense, but what happens, and the problem lies, where there isn't that habit or that discipline to say, I'm now wearing the DevCorp hat and my sole function is economic development, or I'm now wearing the governance hat and my sole function is to support community development. If they don't have that habit, and also the legal risk is where you have a majority of chief and council members on the board, what happens is legally, the Canada Revenue Association looks like it, and legally, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, all those assets come together and you put at risk your own community's assets, not just those of the DevCorp.
Thanks, Laara.
Thank you, Laara. Great presentation. I was never really strong in English, so I actually hadn't heard this word before, but it really struck a chord. And you talked about collectivism values and the idea of leadership not in a position to look at how they're benefiting, but more importantly, how they're benefiting the community. And I'm interested to know how in the work that you've done, you've helped leadership to understand that, because certainly in some of the work that I've done over the years, I have found that it's really been a me syndrome rather than what can I do for the community. So I'm interested to know your experience on that.
That's a great question. I usually facilitate their own wisdom and knowledge in the community, operating from a strengths base. Usually what I ask is an elder or elders or traditional knowledge keepers to come in and ask what their traditional roles of leadership were. And usually they're able to educate the younger leaders to remind them that they're there to serve the entire community. I've never had leaders or traditional knowledge keepers come say otherwise. And it's really interesting because the dynamics change as soon as they're in the room. And sometimes those new leaders who operate from a Western viewpoint or are indoctrinated into a Western viewpoint who kind of go, I might get some benefit out of doing this job. Or I didn't think, whatever their perspectives are, they're humbled because of our respect and our values for respect for elders and traditional knowledge keepers, and they usually will pull back and listen and allow those people to set the tone on what is expected of leaders. And in defining those roles and responsibilities in a culturally relevant way, I usually just facilitate the conversation. But I ask for those people to be involved, and it's always worked out.
Samuel Schooner, New Hope Nation. I'm just, I wanted to, like, I really enjoyed what you have said, and I have tons of notes now. Lots more questions than anything. But I'm really interested in the shared leadership systems.
Yes.
We have a hereditary chief like James here is from my nation too as well, and he's a hereditary chief as well as a council member, and I'm you know, that there's a big divide in that in our community. Well, I wouldn't say a big divide, but there is that divide there. And I'm really interested in learning more about shared leadership systems. If you can touch on that just a little bit more.
Absolutely. So when I was doing my master's degree, one of the papers I looked at, because this was a key area, is organizational development that I wanted to learn about, and I did an interview series with elders and traditional knowledge keepers that I could reach out to. It was probably about 20, and ask them and propose this over the last decade or so of working with communities, that what was the system, and asking those traditional knowledge keepers who are present. And usually we start to uncover ideas and understandings of how people did come together. Now, looking at the history of effective governing institutions in the history of humankind, China, Africa, India, a whole number of communities did this long before the Greeks took credit for it, used shared leadership systems for governing. And what normally happened is what we used to see in our communities too, where we'd have a family head, a hereditary chief, a local representative coming together at that level to be able to discuss and arrive at decisions. And usually for communities around here in BC, again, the language is different for every community. Hereditary chief, family heads, family representatives. Sometimes it's using your own traditional names and words that refer to those people's responsibilities and scope of responsibility. And those people would come together and debate and discuss issues as much as our current leaders do, because that was their job historically. And they were raised over generations and by entire communities to have that capacity and understanding to serve their communities well. What we've done in communities where we've tried to support this balancing of traditional and hereditary systems is to have that discussion. What were your traditional systems? Share those understandings that that system of chief and council is not ours. So what kind of society are you trying to build? And usually the answer is a healthy one. So what models can we look at adapting, or shared models can we look at adapting to meet those ends? And it's usually shared systems that slowly transition shared leadership systems into greater levels of authority and trying to move out a chief and council system. So Tsawwassen a good example. Their legislature is made up of family heads. Not chief and council, not one single authority. A decision comes up, they have their legislative assembly come together and they make decisions as family heads. So it's amazing what can happen. And each community has its own comfort level of what they're willing to support based on the current leadership, based on historical events and issues that have happened in the community. But it's a good discussion to have. What served your community to survive and thrive for 20,000 years as a governing system? And what are we using today? And if you're trying to build this kind of society, like Brian kept saying, what is your vision? Where are you trying to head to? If you're trying to head to there, what's going to be the best mechanism to get you there? And again, I usually just facilitate the discussions. And usually there's always, with communities I've worked with, there's an agreement that, yeah, this wasn't our system. It doesn't work well. We have a lot of challenges. It's not a well-functioning system for engaging members, or what they call an assembly process. And they usually do all agree to say, let's continually support them to be developed.
One more question. So you mentioned ISO certification.
Yes.
And when I mentioned earlier in my presentation, I was back in Sudbury to facilitate a meeting, and the most effective First Nation that was at that meeting, there was about 8 First Nations, was one that was ISO certified. And the ISO certification process actually led the nation right through all of the issues that we have dealt with today to date, as of right from the last minute from this morning. And every time there was something brought forward where someone had a question about chief and council or about this or about that, this person that was at the meeting could pull up in her computer and provide exactly what they would do in that situation. And so I'm just wondering how much you've worked with ISO certification here and how effective it's been with communities that you've introduced it to.
I've helped a couple to get ISO certification, and it wasn't communities, it was like Talahout Aboriginal Capital Corporation, which is the first ISO certified Aboriginal Capital Corporation in Canada. It's worked really well. Again, their effectiveness was predating some of the work that I had done, but I helped support that ISO certification up until the point of about a year into it, once the analysis and assessment was complete, and then I left. But they've done really well and still operate quite effectively today. Organizations have helped to support with the analysis and initiate that discussion. You're exactly right. When we start taking a look at and demystify the word policies to say rules that we all agree to, when we take a look at those rules and we find problems or issues or challenges, if we have as leaders the habit of pulling back to say, what is the rule or policy or procedure that applies to this? And how does it work to serve to resolve this? Then we can understand those changes that need to be made. And it's a difficult habit to make, but it's a very conscientious and conscious decision to make and presence of mind to have to say, what are the policies and procedures? What rules have we agreed on to resolve this issue when it comes up? And when you do it when there isn't an issue, it allows you to put your best self on and your best community decisions forward to say, this is what we should do. And when those challenges are pressed, when the conflict arises, you can go back and test those and revise and continue to revise and test those. But they have worked really well, and the communities I've worked to help support go through that process and move increasingly towards that process with the Business Development Bank of Canada, which I'm a consultant on their roster for as well, has worked really well. Thank you. Thank you very much for all your time.